Sam and I affirm our first point of contention is creating intelligent electricity. As the Electronic Privacy Information Center writes, one of the most prominent examples of the Internet of Things is the smart grid, which is used to better manage energy consumption by creating a line of communication between machines to increase efficiency. As the Department of Energy furthers, smart grids integrate a plethora of technology, including sensors and monitors, to ensure that everything from simple household items to large manufacturing plants are running as efficiently as possible. The usage of real-time data translates to better energy production. As Gil Reitenbach of the American Institute of Engineers writes, that the General Electric Company has used the Internet of Things to increase electrical output by 20%. This has two impacts, and the first is charging up the developing world. While it is hard to imagine, the International Energy Agency writes that currently 17% of the global population lacks access to electricity, also known as energy poverty. According to Brian Walsh of Time, 95% of those lacking electricity are located in sub-Saharan Africa or South Asia. He furthers, due to its lack of global attention and effect on an individual's health and wealth, energy poverty is the worst form of poverty. Luckily, the solution is near. As a 2014 Atlantic article explains, nations in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia have the ability to leapfrog energy grids, outdated energy grids, and start from scratch at the cutting edge as they enter their era of development. In his analysis for the Global Energy Institute, Peter Meissen found that increasing access to electricity had a strong positive relationship with life expectancy and GDP per capita, while significantly decreasing mortality rates. For this reason, the McKinsey Global Institute finds that 40% of the IoT's value over the next decade lies in the developing world. Second is making energy clean. According to a report conducted by the ABB Group, smart grids have the capacity to not only make current energy more efficient, but also integrate low-carbon energy sources into pre-existing power grids, such as solar or wind power. As Rishi Bhatt of SAP states, the Internet of Things is a vital mechanism for the advancement of green energy. This is why Oscar Alvarez of the KTH Institute found in his empirical analysis of the developed and the developing world that the implementation of smart grids has historically gone hand in hand with the increased usage of renewable energy sources. The impact comes from Ashoka Kella of the National Institute of Technology, who found in his analysis of a dozen energy sources that on net, renewable energy had 1/10 of the carbon dioxide emissions that fossil fuels had. Holistically, Masood Amin of the University of Minnesota furthers that the adoption of the smart grid would cause energy efficiency to increase and emissions to decrease by 18%, which is why he finds there's a 6-to-1 ratio of benefits to costs when it comes to adopting the smart grid. Overall, the implementation of smart grids can be seen throughout the world, not just in the United States. For instance, CNN reports that India plans to upgrade 100 cities with smart grids in the coming decade, and the China-Britain Council reports that China has already implemented almost 300 smart grids throughout various cities. Our second point of contention is creating intelligent agriculture. A Beecham research report finds that precision agriculture makes use of a range of technologies that include GPS services, sensors, and big data to optimize crop yields. Support systems, backed by real-time data, can provide information concerning all aspects of farming at a level of precision not previously possible. This enables better decisions to be made, resulting in less waste and maximum efficiency in operations. Jeff Hahn of RCR Wireless News finds that estimates show that farmers using agricultural IoT systems can see yields increase by up to 15%, which translates up to $100 more per acre. The impact comes from the World Bank, who finds that a 1% increase in crop yields creates a 0.6% reduction in the number of people living in poverty. Therese Corey of Beecham Research warns that if the farming industry does not embrace the use of precision agriculture and harness the emerging Internet of Things, it will be literally impossible to feed the world population by 2050. Feed the world and affirm.
Can I see Reitenbach?
Can I also see the Atlantic evidence?
26.
What is that?
Deploying development.
Maybe we should have asked for the table.
Use both. No. Let me hold you up. Are you sure you want to do it?
I'm really not sure.
Okay.
Cheers.
Do you want to have your stuff?
Do you need your?
I need one.
Yeah.
It's not your computer. Can we look at either
You can
of
look
the
at it
two?
during practice.
Sure. That's fine.
So not. Can we look at it during class?
Don't worry about it now. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, great.
Everyone good? Okay. We negate our first and only contention is that the Internet of Things will supercharge the surveillance state. The IoT entails a rapid expansion of sensor networks embedded in everyday objects, including things like location trackers and cameras and microphones that never turn off. Harold Bauer of the McKinsey Institute projects that up to 50 billion IoT sensors will be active in 2020, leading Victor Meyer of Foreign Affairs to predict that the amount of digitalized personal data will double every 3 years, while the International Data Group writes that, quote, there will be a 13% increase in unique new data by 2020 collected by new technologies. Unfortunately, as Matthew Olson of Harvard explains, these sensors are the prime mechanisms for mass surveillance, as they allow governments to conjoin more data from various sources to create a singularity of information that is more personal and more dangerous than the sum of its parts. The way governments access our data is by exploiting vulnerabilities. As Peter Denning of the Naval Postgraduate School explains, IoT companies rush their products to the market because if they spend too much time developing, competitors beat them to the punch and they lose market share. Corporations therefore minimize time spent fixing defects and securitizing, which is why Denning finds that companies release tech despite being aware of critical vulnerabilities 80% of the time. Olson furthers that over the last few years, the increased availability of encryption has slowed surveillance efforts to a halt. However, this effect is quickly being reversed by the Internet of Things. As Luigi Azzori of the University of Cagliari explains, IoT components are fundamentally characterized by low capabilities in energy and computing resources, and therefore cannot implement security schematics. Even if IoT devices were protected, governments would simply force companies to build backdoors into products either through monetary incentive or compulsory legislation, while Tim Sparapani of Forbes writes that as countries like the United States, China, and Russia pursue these backdoors, surveillance capabilities will increase at an alarming rate. The intent is clear. Ex-CIA Director David Petraeus says, quote, the emergence of an Internet of Things will be a treasure trove of data for identifying persons of interest. IoT-based surveillance is more intrusive for two reasons. First, by compromising other devices. Unlike conventional technology, the IoT operates on machine-to-machine communication, where each sensor on a network transmits data to every other unit. This allows officials to infiltrate one device and gather data from others. Indeed, a 2015 HP Enterprise report finds that as IoT adoption expands, security concerns exponentially multiply as intrusions can lead to a single gateway that accesses 60 others. Second, by raising the threshold for what can be watched. Conventional surveillance is limited to the digital world, specifically information that people decide to close online with consent. In contrast, the IoT bridges the technology into the real physical world. As Neil Richards of the Harvard Law Review writes, over the next 15 years, the Internet of Things will increasingly be built into our appliances, homes, and infrastructure, subjecting previously unobservable activity to close scrutiny. Bruce Schneier of The Guardian concludes, the Internet of Things will give governments and corporations that follow our every move something that they don't yet have. Eyes and ears. The impact is discrimination. For example, Deepa Kumar of Rutgers University writes that any expansion of the surveillance state strengthens institutions of racism as governments tend to focus on minorities due to aggregates of poverty and crime. And for example, the ACLU quantifies black citizens are 2.5 times more likely to be watched than their non-black counterparts. Valkia Sarwal of the Progressive Institute continues that because the widest net is cast over the black population, African Americans are exponentially more likely to end up in prison and have fundamentally become intertwined with perceptions of criminality. This effect certainly isn't limited to the United States. As Gordon Goldstein of the Wall Street Journal writes, overtly racist governments like Saudi Arabia, Iran, China, and Russia have all designed tactics to manipulate the Internet of Things and have shown their intent at the International Telecommunications Union Network conference. Michael Minkenberg of the Georgetown University furthers, autocratic regimes in Eastern Europe and Central Asia have historically used surveillance as a tool to control and oppress ethnic minorities. Until this trend is overturned, MIT's Noam Chomsky writes, governments will, quote, use whatever technology is available to combat their primary enemy, their own population. Far from representative, nations only serve segments of the population that are dominant, affluent, and of the same color. As a result, Catherine Beckett of the University of Washington argues, the most unsurprising consequence of an intensifying surveillance state is the burgeoning number of minorities that are suppressed, incarcerated, and marginalized by their government. In order to prevent this structural oppression, we urge you to negate. Give me a section to put the desk on. Okay. So just to clarify, it's you need your computer for cross-access? Yeah.
Alright, is everyone ready?
Can we just use your time?
Yeah.
Okay.
compared to the surveillance that's going on right now, how is the impact on minorities and like people of color any different in your world?
What do you mean?
Like, aren't people already jailed and discriminated against to such a high level today?
Yeah.
Okay, so how does that get so much worse in your world?
We're not saying it gets so much worse. We're saying it gets worse.
All right, moreover, why do you
Actually, do you mind if I get a question?
No, no.
Okay, sure. So let's talk about electricity. First, you say that we're going to expand electricity to Africa. Second, you say that we're going to make clean energy. Aren't we trying to do that without the Internet of Things anyways?
I mean, the Internet of Things accelerates that process.
How much?
How much?
Yeah.
Like 6 accelerations. Like, what do you want me to say? Like,
I don't know, maybe a time frame.
All right, Alvarez says that historically, anytime we've developed smart grids, empirically what has happened is more development of renewable energy sources in tandem. Does that
But
work?
how much more?
How much more?
Yeah.
Like, I say like a 1-to-1. I don't know. But like, more importantly, let's talk about let's talk about your case. Why do you assume that there won't be like encryptions or protections on like important IoT data?
That's not my assumption. So Ardrey writes that these devices are primarily based on low computing power and like
Just
low
because
energy
they have
capacity.
low computing power, why does that mean that servers
It means
can't be
that
protected? Servers that
The
hold the data
servers,
can't be encrypted.
the servers don't really have anything to do with the Internet of Things. Once you get into
Yes,
one,
they do. Hold on. When you
Okay,
when you
hold
put
on.
information
If I can
into a
finish,
device, it's literally connected to another device. That's machine to machine, meaning it goes to something like a server, which gives that data out to
Sure.
other things. So why?
Sure.
My question is, why isn't there a level of encryption
because
on
the
that
server can be encrypted, but once you get into an IoT device, you get access to everything on the server.
That's
But
not
even
true.
if you,
That's how encryptions work. Just because you
right,
get access
and
to
our
one
argument
thing,
is
doesn't
that
mean you get
encryption
access
is
to
much
everything.
weaker on the Internet of Things because you need uninhibited network
We would
pathways
contend
for a
that just like
rapid transfer of
computers,
data.
we would contend that just like the invention of computers, that encryption would increase over time.
And our argument is that fundamentally and definitionally that's not possible because the Internet of Things requires rapid transfers of data on uninhibited network pathways. At best, you maybe get 64-bit.
No,
like
it
so,
doesn't.
this
That's
is the
just your
Olsen evidence.
conjecture.
No. This is the Olsen evidence.
Which
It's very
was that?
clear in saying that. Right? Like for example, metadata also is really hard to be encrypted. That's
Olsen,
because it
what I
needs to
have
be
Olsen
transferred
saying is
rapidly.
that like data's
Okay,
data's
well,
important for mass
whatever you
surveillance.
have him saying right now, just add that onto it, right? That's our argument, and we're going to maintain it for the rest of the life.
I would contend that even if there are high and like free amounts of data flows, then that still can be encrypted. And I would say it's encrypted at different levels too.
I agree,
For instance,
I agree.
things like medical records and like
No. Now I disagree. So we're
hold
just saying that.
on.
Sure,
I haven't
go
even
ahead.
said anything. So things like
I
medical
know what you're
records
gonna say. I know
and
what you're
credit
gonna
cards
say.
information, those are going to have higher amounts of encryption than things like what your toaster does in the morning. Like,
Right, I agree with the fundamental idea that information should probably be prioritized. But my fundamental disagreement is that the encryption levels aren't differing by the importance of the data. It's just that all IoT data probably has a maximum of like a 64-bit or a 128-bit encryption, whereas computer pathways have a 1028-bit encryption that the government has not hacked into yet,
Can you
has not
simplify that
created.
for me?
I mean, it's
Like, I
just
don't
like
know
it's
what that
way
means.
harder for us to encrypt like pathways that the Internet of Things transfers data on.
How
That's
can I
like been
take
our
your
argument.
word for it? Can you give me a source that says that?
That's Olsen, yeah.
Olsen? All right.
Because you didn't write it down yet. You have to do that.
The argument is that. Can I?
Review on their case. Just go down to one contention. You guys good?
Yeah, I'm good.
Okay. Ready? So really quickly on an overview, recognize that with the spread of the Internet of Things, you need a preceding spread of the Internet, and that comes from the GWSA, who finds that the IoT will directly facilitate the broadband expansion of networks. They find that by 2020, the number of Internet-connected devices in the world will almost triple to 25 billion. The spread of the Internet is important for 3 reasons. The first is that it spreads democracy. According to Keegan Wade of Georgia Tech, allowing half of a population to connect to the Internet sparks political discourse, which shapes the beginning of a democracy, which is why she finds that allowing Internet access increases democracy, political rights, and civil liberties by 15%. Second, it benefits the economy. As Shane Chu of Chuangyang University finds, a 10 percentage point increase in Internet penetration rates increases real GDP per capita by 0.6 percentage points. Third, it saves lives. According to Deloitte, providing broadband access to 75% of the population has the ability to increase health literacy, and as a result, save nearly 2.5 million lives in the developing world. With that in mind, that's a unique benefit off of our case. Now let's talk about theirs. Their whole thesis here is this idea of surveillance. Recognize a couple of things on base. The first comes from a Melina Saluk of NPR, who finds that governments across the world have reduced their push for a legislation allowing IoT to be used as justification for surveillance. This is a problem that's not even becoming a problem as they speculate it will be. Even more so recognized from the Freedom House report, autocratic governments, the ones that they talk so heavily about on surveilling their people, actually increase surveillance in the face of economic losses. So, cross-apply the observation I just gave you, which says that the internet actually provides economic benefits, you will see a decrease in the need for surveillance. Even more so, let's move to their own evidence, the Olson analysis, which they said that the government will use this data to surveil. Instead, the Olson analysis says that the data will be able to be used. It has the ability to be used to surveil. They never give you a probability that governments will 100% use this data to surveil on their citizens. Even more so, they then talk about this Denning, which says that 80% of IoT tech is vulnerable. The problem is, this is talking about smartphone apps, not the Internet of Things. Make them show you the vulnerability of the Internet of Things. Next, let's move on to this idea about backdoors, which they talk so heavily about. The problem is, backdoors have to be open. What David Auerbach of Slate finds is that the majority of private companies will not allow the government to have access to their data. So at that point, the government literally has no data pool with which they can discriminate from. But let's talk about discrimination. The first type they read you is police discrimination. What Colin DeLito of Nashville finds is the most egregious violations of racial targeting are fueled by cell site simulators, or stingrays, which is data pulled from cell phones. What we're talking about is massive police surveillance using cell phones, which are not a part of the Internet of Things. This is a problem that exists and is already a tremendously bad in the status quo without the Internet of Things. They never show you why the Internet of Things uniquely increases racial discrimination and police targeting. Make them do that for you. Even more so recognize that it's not as bad as they make it out to be. In fact, David Slancy of Stanford finds that the data, that big data produced by the Internet of Things increases police accountability, and it was the only reason why stop and frisk was deemed unconstitutional was because of big data created by the Internet of Things. Big data actually increases police accountability and subsequently decreases racial profiling. Next, let's move on to their only impact, which is discrimination on a general level. Recognize we're going to turn this on face from Alison Bruzak of PBS, who finds that the Internet of Things increases efficiency, which decreases inequality for two reasons. The first, it reduces the cost of living, which is inherently retrogressive, and the second, it allows people more time to find employment. Even more so, this is a problem that's going away in the status quo. What Scott Peppett at the University of Colorado finds is that the legal loopholes that allow for discrimination to exist today as a result of the Internet of Things are currently being closed. Even more so, look at the time frame analysis. As Brian Kruger of Rhode Island University finds that the effects of discrimination actually increase voter participation rates. What he finds is that people who are discriminated against by the government exponentially increase their voter participation rates and are more likely to affect democracy and change the government that they so badly feel about. At the end of the round, you might think, while this might be a problem now, except it self-corrects itself. Even more so recognize that every single piece of statistic that they read you in their case talks about regular surveillance. The 2.5 times African Americans, that's regular surveillance. It is their burden to show you that number increases with the IoT, insofar as they never show you uniquely why the Internet of Things worsens the racial discrimination that has already so heavily entrenched itself into the American political society today. They have no unique harms. The uniqueness is the only way you can negate in today's round, and the point where they have that, do not have that uniqueness, I urge you to affirm.
Can we see the Atlantic evidence that I called for?
Also, the Solansi evidence that the Internet of Things use big data to end stop and frisk or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
Are the judges ready? So it's going to be an overview, and then I'm going to respond to his overview and then go down their case.
The overview on your case?
I'd say float at the bottom of our case. Wait, on both at the bottom. Okay.
Of your case?
Yeah. Are you ready? I can ask.
Wait, no, now you gotta share them with me. First one of the day.
No thanks.
Alright, we can go.
Okay. As an overview, weigh racism first because Albert Memmi writes against reject every instance of racism. No life is worth living if some lives are valued over others. Institutional racism is a systemic impact. It happens every second of every day. Lives are by definition temporary. Exacerbating racism is a generational impact. Our brothers in the Civil War knew this and sacrificed their lives to fight for the Union Army. Second, Scott Peppett of the University of Colorado writes in 2015 that the kind of discrimination the IoT brings cannot be controlled by anti-discrimination laws. This is going to be important later on, but now I'm going to go to his overview, basically like a third contention for them. But first, the argument is non-unique. It is profitable for companies. Ben Popper of The Verge writes in 2013 that Facebook's supposed philanthropic endeavor to bring internet to the third world would bring itself enormous revenue as well. Corporations don't need the Internet of Things to be the impetus to give countries the gift of the World Wide Web. But B, the argument is non-unique because Doe Gross of CNN writes in 2013 that the Google CEO has promised that everyone in the world will be on the Internet by 2020. With or without the IoT, Internet will reach every corner of the globe. Now, go to the contention one about intelligent electricity. Starting with the first up point about the developing world. First of all, I called for the Atlantic evidence. It does not address the price, the problems with like the price of energy grids, which I'm going to address in my responses. First, take out the links with Mark Levinson of Issues in Science and Technology writes in 2010 that smart grids are far too expensive to build. Constructing just one would cost almost $100 billion in the United States. It's absurd to think that they would go to the developing world. But second, take out their impact because Chris Mooney of the Washington Post writes in 2015 that smart grids are ineffective. After the U.S. installed them in 50 million homes across the U.S., there was no substantial decrease in energy usage. But second, now go to their second point about cleaner energy. First, they talk about like the move to renewables, but this is just not true. Richard Martin at MIT Technology Review writes in 2016 that the IoT would prolong the life of dying coal plants. We are currently in the middle of a transition from coal to natural gas. However, the advent of the IoT would stifle that transition by improving the performance of aging coal plants, encouraging utility companies to keep them running rather than shutting them down. He concludes that net long-term emissions will go up. But second, the free rider effect. Alex Pritchard of the University of Exeter explains that developing countries would perceive decreases in emissions as an excuse for them to relax environmental legislation, while other countries step up their action against climate change. Robert Stavins of Harvard University confirms that poorer industrializing countries have insisted that global leaders foot most of the bill in terms of reducing CO2 emissions. Indeed, Gautam Naik of Wall Street Journal writes that even if some countries reduce emissions, other countries will simply make up for pollution by increasing their industrialization. We won't see developing countries shift to renewables especially, but now go to the contention to agriculture. First, take out the link A because the International Telecommunications Union writes in 2016 that the costs associated with sensors and connectivity would prevent individual small farmers from using the IoT. They say sensors are dirt cheap, but Jim Daly of Wired writes in 2016 that typical IoT farms have thousands of sensors, when most farmers in developing countries make less than $1.25 per day, implying that they can afford full capacity IoT agricultural systems is absurd. But V. Jacob Bunch of the Wall Street Journal writes in 2014 that farmers do not trust putting their agricultural data on the internet and thus won't use it. They worry that their data might be sold to commodity traders, wind up in the hands of rival farmers, or give more leverage to giant seed companies. But second, Evan Fraser of The Guardian writes in 2016 that the IoT work in tandem with automated machines and robots to almost completely automate industrial agriculture, leading to a disproportionate loss of jobs. This means two things. A permanent loss of jobs in the agricultural sector. Adam Taggart of Free Peak Prosperity concludes in 2016 that jobs displaced by technology will never come back. But B, highly mechanized farms on large acreages can produce units of food cheaper than even the poorest paid farms in the third world. When this cheap food is sold or given to the third world, the local farm economy is destroyed. But fourth, Reuters writes that an increase in emissions inevitably leads to a loss of arable land. They predict that Africa will have almost no arable land in the near future. But now let's go to some weighing. Racism controls the internal link into economic inequality that farmers are subjected to. Robert Buller of the UNRSID writes in 2001 that institutional racism anywhere reinforces the ability of dominant countries and races to be environmentally racist. This means two things. One, developed countries carry out acts of racism against developing countries, but two, and more importantly, environmental racism as a form of intra-nation power arrangement allows members of the dominant race in each country to seclude minorities and eviscerate their ability to be economically mobile. This is not an impact that is just limited to the United States. It applies to their developing countries as well. And for these reasons, I strongly urge you to vote for the negative.
Can you reasonably articulate why racism is more important than, let's say, like sexism, classism, ableism?
No.
So why is it particularly that we're impacting to racism is the most important as opposed to like discriminatory prejudices in general?
No, I'm saying that racism is more important than lives, which is what you impact to, or economic mobility, which is the second set of weighing.
I just want to clarify that like all the isms are on an equal playing field, right?
Sure. Are you going to go for an ism impact?
No.
Maybe. I don't know. All right. So
wait. Racism, sexism, and
wait, we're back.
I guess
We're
ableism is
backpedaling
okay,
now on
but
the
not.
answer that all
Classism
isms
is
are the
different. Classism is different. Like economic mobility, that's different. We wouldn't agree that that's on the same level.
What's the difference between the government discriminating
you were
against
gonna
someone
go for
because
that.
they're poor versus someone? So like the difference is that like it's something Harish and I have access to. That's
No, it's not. It's because like economic mobility can happen within races as well. But it's
I
not.
understand
It's not a
that, but
structural
in terms
harm.
of discrimination, what is the difference?
Okay,
between
there's two responses.
I haven't
First
even
of all,
finished my. Wait, how are you
sure.
responding to a question I haven't asked?
I kind of know what you're going to say, but yeah, just
Okay.
finish your thought.
So, in terms of the government's discrimination against people, what's the difference between the government discriminating against someone because of their skin color versus their gender versus the
So
amount
you're
of money
going
in
to
their
argue
bank
that
account?
classism is something that the government propagates?
I don't know what Harish is going to say in the summary. There's
All right.
no reason
Okay.
to prefer
Okay,
racism
first of all-
over any
first of
other
all-
kind of institutionalized prejudice.
No, first of all, I would say that we will respond to that after Harish makes the argument, but second of all, the Bullard weighing at the bottom line rebuttal makes it very clear that racism comes before economic mobility and controls the link into economic mobility. Can I get a question? You've had like half a cross.
I'm really struggling with the idea on why racism is different than classism or sexism or ableism.
No,
right?
you can't put all of those four on the same playing field. Racism, sexism, and
They're all
ableism are
discrimination.
structural harms. Classism is not a form of discrimination. It is something like it's something that you're born into, right? No, sorry, that's not the right way to put it. Classism
It
is
seems
not
like
something
you're
that.
falling prejudice to like
No,
elitist
let me
structures that you
finish what I'm
condemn in
saying.
your own
Let me finish what I'm
papers.
saying. Classism is something that you, like, the government cannot control. Now, can I get my question?
Well, yes, they can. That's what
Okay, look,
welfare is
we can-
supposed
we
to
can
do,
get back
is
to
to
this
try to
after, like-
offset the like repercussions
Okay,
of classism.
I'm going to ask you a question. You said that cell phones are the greatest form of discrimination.
No, I say
You
they're
said
one of the
that,
most
so-
I said the word egregious. I picked my
You
words
said
carefully.
most
It's a good word.
egregious.
I said it's the most
Yeah,
egregious
okay.
example of
What's the
police
difference
discrimination.
between that and what I asked? No, that's not my point though. If I call for your evidence, will your evidence say that cell phones cause the most egregious form of discrimination?
I mean, you can call for it.
Well, it even has
says,
a
it's,
superlative
sorry,
in
it
it?
says the worst example.
It says that.
Yes.
Okay, I'll call for it now.
Okay, so on the Denning evidence, what exactly is it talking about in terms of 80% of what for vulnerable?
It's talking about 80% of like all technology in general.
It says smartphone apps.
No.
Time.
Ready?
Yeah.
Go.
Can I see the cell phone stuff?
Afterwards.
Okay, let's start again.
What's the time?
What's it?
Yeah, 35
No,
seconds.
no, not that time.
Then he has 35 seconds.
Thank you.
Alright, I'll be starting on the idea of internet. Is everyone ready? You guys good? Starting on internet, realize Sam tells you that the amount of internet devices are going to triple, and the IoT fosters broadband networks in these countries. He makes a couple responses. One, he says we don't need the IoT, and second, he says with or without the IoT, internet's going to expand. Unluckily for him, he can't choose what causes of the internet expansion he wants to pick. Realize that the IoT is something that exists, and one of the reasons why the internet is going to expand is literally the IoT. So he can't pick and choose what he wants to call a cause of the internet expansion. Sam gives you 3 impacts, none of which he touched. The first is democracy. Realize that half the population has internet access. That increases the amount of democracy by 15%. That's civil liberties and political rights. Here's how that applies to their case. If you have more democracy and more civil rights, then clearly this impact or surveillance is going to be less, because you can partition for political change. But secondly, the idea that a 10% increase in internet penetration leads to a 0.6% increase in GDP per capita. Realize that's benefiting people's class. At the point where racism literally is a manifestation of low economic status, if we're increasing the amount of economic status, that is going to solve back partially for this impact. And third and finally, realize we increase health literacy. That's a direct impact to lives right there. But here's how this applies in the entirety to his case. First, remember Sam tells you that autocrats increase oppression when they face economic losses. So if we're insulating from economic losses, that means there's less oppression going on overall. That's a reason to vote for the IoT. Now, there's a PEPIT analysis that they don't respond to. Realize he says, PEPIT tells you that because the Internet of Things is in its infancy, right now we don't see a lot of legislation protecting people against the Internet of Things. But as we continue, just like computers, we'll see more legislation that protects people. Now, lastly, on the idea of the electric grid, he tells you it's $100 billion per city. That's not true. The New York Times tells us that it's $300 billion over 20 years in all cities in the United States. Not even close to what he's saying. Next, Amin tells you that there's a 6-to-1 ratio of benefits to cost, and there's an 18% reduction in emissions. So even if you buy everything he's saying, there's still an 18% reduction in emissions. That's benefiting real people's lives, and that's a reason to affirm the resolution.
Can I see the New York Times and the 18% reduction?
Yeah.
Why?
talk about the taste.
Yeah, I know that.
Maybe I should have another one.
I just want water, honestly.
I have high shoes.
Actually, do you have water? I have water.
Okay, who wants what?
I'm gonna just.
I want the 18% first.
Okay,
You can give $300.
18%.
That was
here.
awful pro.
And then this is 300 people.
Alright,
What else
ready?
Wait.
Can I get some context? It's just like one line.
No, it's over there.
It's a list of all the benefits. There's
Yeah,
no
yeah.
minus
You
them.
can stop press until you both take it.
Yeah, we're not.
Yeah. So it's a list of all the benefits.
Is there
There's
like
nine
one
of
talk
them.
specifically about this one?
No.
Okay, that's fine.
Alright, ready?
Yeah.
Go.
Hurry.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Stop.
41 seconds.
Thanks.
Where's the thing? Oh, wait,
30 seconds, right? So it'll start on the internet and then smart grids and then our case. Okay. Really no one has any water in this room?
Yeah, seriously.
That's crazy. Okay.
I read it, I'm not giving it up, sorry.
That's fine. All this. That's okay.
Yep.
I was not expecting that. Anyways. Good, right? Yeah. On the internet, Gross says that we're going to have internet for the large majority of the world by 2020, even without the Internet of Things. If the internet was going to get there anyways without the IoT, they get no impact. It's very negligible. You can't weigh it. Then, on smart grids, the first thing that they tried to read is the New York Times says that it's going to be $300 billion for every single city. It definitely doesn't say every single city, and even then, $300 billion is still way too cost prohibitive for developing countries which don't have that much money. And third of all, it doesn't say the words Internet of Things in it at all. It's not smart cities. It's just grids in general. Then, extend 2 turns on emission, which is the impact that they go for, because they don't actually tell you how that 6-to-1 actually materializes in the pockets of consumers. First, they don't respond to Pritchard, who says that developing countries perceive decreases in emissions as an excuse for them to relax environmental legislation while other countries step up their action against that climate change or emissions. Gnaik of the Wall Street Journal then writes that if some countries reduce their emissions, others will simply make up for it and produce even more. And that's really harmful because they don't specifically impact 2 developing countries, especially because it's so cost prohibitive. But second, you can also extend coal, which specifically says that we're going to prolong the life of coal and prevent the transition to natural gas, which means that green tech that they talk about doesn't get implemented. That's a reason not to vote for them. Now go to racism. First, group all of his responses to non-uniqueness 3 responses. First, Ardrey of the internet writes that the internet thinks it's incredibly weak security. You need an uninhibited network pathways to transfer data quickly. He doesn't respond to this at all. This is in contrast to conventional technology like phones and computers, which are already being encrypted heavily. That's why the cell phone stuff that he talks about isn't going to continue happening in the status quo. But second, the head of the rebuttal says, and also they don't respond to this, said the IoT has no anti-discrimination law, while regularized surveillance is somewhat restrained because the IoT is still an unregulated industry. He reads Pepin on the other side saying that laws will be passed, and he also reads the Saluk evidence. You can group these 2 together about how there's going to be a decline in the push for legislation. 1, this was all before a Trump presidency and the rise of the alt-right populist movement, which wants to crack down on minority rights. Their analysis is outdated. But 2, we don't need new legislation to surveil because the existing prison program is enough to exploit this data. Then you can extend Richards, who says that the IoT brings surveillance into the physical world. Then you can extend IDG, which confirms this 13% more data useful to the government. They say that economic losses cause surveillance, but they don't say that economic gains means more surveillance. It's not a logical conclusion because governments want to maximize control. Then he says there's no probability, but Petraeus says that we would literally be a treasure trove for tracking data, and a bunch of countries want to do it. Then he reads Solansi saying that big data ended soft and first, but that's not the Internet of Things. And second, it just leads to more insidious forms of discrimination that are less overt, which is much worse. That gives us MEMI, which is incredibly important because you have to reject every single instance of racism. It's a precursor to lives and any form of ethical decision making whatsoever. And that's why we're proud to negate.
You said it.
Can I get a Skittle? Are you out?
And only have high shoes.
That's fine.
Pretty trash. Everybody ready? So, like, is there any analysis you guys give that says that discrimination will remain unchecked?
What does that mean?
like
In-
right
into
now
the
there
future.
might be like problems because we don't have regulation regarding it, but that in the future like that will stay the same.
I feel like it's more reasonable to say that it'll stay the same than for something to change.
I
Why?
know.
Well, yeah, on why? Like
Because, like, for example, we've been discriminating for a long time, right? We
I
don't
would
have
say
any,
like the
laws on
overall
it.
trend though is like from like slavery to where we are today. Like
I'll
it's
give you
gotten
that.
better. Even more so, the analysis I read you in my rebuttal that goes uncontested is that when groups are discriminated against, it
They
increases
vote
their
more, right,
political
right,
participation.
and I agree, and I would have to argue that you have to show me that, like, terminalizes some kind of, like, structural change in the government, right?
Well, yeah,
like,
the problem is,
100,000
you
more
guys-
minorities
like,
vote in,
you're
like,
asking me to
Alabama, it's not
terminalize
gonna change
structural.
anything.
You're asking me to terminalize structural government changes when you can't even terminalize to me the actual increase in surveillance or increase in
we
racial
do.
surveillance that occurs. No, you tell me that racial surveillance goes on and that the IoT facilitates surveillance, but you don't actually show me a net increase in harm, right?
What does that even mean?
Like, you tell us that, like,
Why-
police are racist now. You also tell us, on a separate tangent, that the IoT creates big data, which may or may not be used to surveil on its citizens, and then you just mash those together at the end and say,
I'm actually
well,
still
we-
really confused.
How? Oh, with your own case?
No,
So
no,
am
with
I,
what you're
yeah.
saying.
Okay, so you tell us that right now, like, African Americans are 2.5 times more likely to be surveilled,
Yeah,
right?
yep.
That's in traditional surveillance measures. You also tell us that big data is created, which may or may not be used to surveil on people, right?
Yeah.
And then you just push those two together and say that, like, big data will be used to surveil on minorities and will have, like, massive incarceration disparities.
So then two things. First of all, I think that pushing them together is probably a fine logical conclusion to make. If we were racist before, we'll probably be racist with the Internet of Things too. But the second thing, right?
That's not a harm, though. You understand that, right? Like,
No.
because
So
IoT,
the argument-
IoT just allows for the continuation of racism.
No.
at a
And
level
here's
that
why you're
was
wrong, right?
pre-IoT.
Here's why you're
That's
wrong.
not a harm of
So there's
personal
three
privacy.
reasons why you're wrong, and you don't really respond to any of them. The first one is the Richards evidence that says we raised the ceiling for what's surveillable, which means it's more contextually enriching and more personal. The second one is that we would say that conventional surveillance is on the decline because already conventional technology like computers and cell phones, which we were surveilling before,
Can you
are
give
being
me
more
any
encrypted.
analysis that says that conventional surveillance is on the decline?
Yeah, that's our whole argument from Olson. And like you literally read evidence that says that governments are not pushing for legislation anymore because they can't, because it's encrypted. That's your Saluk evidence.
Governments aren't pushing for legislation to allow
Hey,
the
Keshav,
IoT
say
to
something.
surveil.
Okay, sorry, what were you saying? I mean, like, at the point where you haven't, like, you failed to give us a probability analysis.
We definitely do. Petraeus says that he wants to do it. These countries have set out and they
Petraeus
want
says
to.
one
And
person
I
in
want
one
to win this round, but there's no guarantee that it's going to happen.
I agree
right?
with you
There's
there.
still a lot of right?
What are you saying? Like, what more do you want? That we've already done it because we can give you evidence on that.
No, like you're literally just telling us that like
what
the
more
door
do you
is
want?
there, and
What
there are
more do you
people who
want?
like are interested. Well, how about a current politician? You really literally reading
Sure.
someone who got fired from their job.
That's fine. Sure. We'll do that. And we did, I think.
Petraeus.
I mean, yeah.
Are you guys taking 35 seconds of prep?
Yes, we
Hey, Rob. Is there water?
Dude, just wait 10 minutes.
All right.
Very good.
It's gonna go like back and forth between cases, so I'll sign this one away.
What was the overview?
I mean, I'll make it clear. I'm gonna kind of jump around. Okay. Everybody ready? Alright. So the main reason you're going to be affirming in today's round is that undoubtedly the Internet of Things makes the world a better place. On a quick observation level, what I tell you in rebuttal from Pepin is that while loopholes may exist right now to allow discrimination through the Internet of Things, those loopholes are being closed, meaning that literally their entire case, their only terminal impact to racism, is being solved back for it in the status quo. At that point, you have no unique reason to negate. Even more so, what I tell you in Grand Crossfire is that they never show you an actual increase in the amount of racial surveillance that's going on, rather a continuation of the status quo, which is not a harm of decreased personal privacy. You have no reason to negate today's round, but I'm going to give you two reasons on top of that on why you're affirming. The first is the spread of the Internet. With the GW GWSA finds is that while there may be other reasons for why the internet's spreading, such as Google and Facebook's cooperative initiative, they find that the IoT will facilitate a tripling in the amount of devices connected to the internet. That does two things. The first comes from Wade, in which she finds that you increase democracy by 15%. The comparative analysis to do here is that if you value combating racial and injustice structures, that will always be easier to do in a democracy as opposed to an autocracy. So we're actually linking into their terminal impact better than they are. The second comes from Chu, which finds that you increase per capita GDP by 0.6%. The analysis I give you, rebuttal, that goes uncontested, is that authoritarian regimes increase their surveillance in face of economic losses. So transitively, when we help the economy, you decrease surveillance. If you think surveillance is so terrible, then you're going to want to decrease it, and the only way to do that is through providing economic gains, which are made possible through the Internet of Things. The second way in which the Internet of Things makes the world a better place is by revolutionizing energy. What we tell you is that smart grids will be applied. What they tell you is that they will cost hundreds of billions of dollars per smart grid. What Harish tells you from the New York Times is that it will cost $300 billion to apply smart grids to every major U.S. city. What Alvarez tells you is historically, when you apply smart grid, you increase green technology usage, which is why Amin finds in his holistical empirical analysis that you increase efficiency 18%, decrease emissions 18%, and on net, there is a 6-to-1 ratio of benefits to costs. If that's not beneficial enough, then I don't know what is. Because the Internet of Things is always a step in a positive direction. I urge you to affirm.
Okay.
Okay, have 41 seconds left.
How many?
41. Ready? Go.
Oh, sure. We'll just use your timer.
All right.
Yeah. Oh, actually, yeah.
I just need that paragraph. That's okay.
You drink all the water. Yeah, sure.
Water Wars.
No.
I didn't think about it. Okay. I'm going to start on their internet argument, and then energy argument, and then just go to argument. Alright. On the internet argument, the only card that's extended in the final focus is the GWSA card. Sorry. Thanks, dude. I'm just going to repeat that.
Sorry.
It's okay. On the internet argument, the only card that's extended in final focus is the GWSA card that says that 3 times more devices are connected to the internet, but that doesn't mean the actual internet spreads. They can't access their impact there, but even then, Gross says the internet would reach these countries by 2020 anyway, so they get no offense. But now, let's go to the energy. There are 2 clean drop turns here. That's the easiest way to sign your ballot. First, the free rider effect says, from Pritchard tells you that developing countries would perceive decreases in emissions as an excuse for them to relax environmental progress. That gives you statements that says that poor industrializing countries have insisted that global leaders put most of the bill, and so that move to renewables will never happen, and that is a non-net harm for their case. But second, Reuters writes that an increase in emissions inevitably leads to a loss of arable land. They predict that Africa will have almost no arable land in the near future. And finally, the only response they have left on this argument is the 18% decrease in emissions on net. That evidence does not say on net. Please call for it. But now go to our case. A couple of responses he has left. First, he says that there's new legislation being passed. First of all, that is very outdated. That is before Trump was elected. But second, all of his remaining responses are about racism happening right now. But we give you 3 unique responses from the summary that were not responded to in the first final focus. First of all, the Azori evidence tells you that IoT components are fundamentally characterized by low capabilities in energy and computing resources and cannot implement security measures and cannot be encrypted. But second, Pepe tells you that the kind of discrimination the IoT brings cannot be controlled by anti-discrimination laws. But third, Richards writes that the IoT brings surveillance into the physical world and raises the ceiling for what can and can't be surveilled. These are 3 very unique ways that the IoT increases the ability for governments to be racist. The IDG on net says there's a 13% increase in useful data for the government to use in surveillance. Kumar says that any expansion of the surveillance state will be racist, and Goldstein says that this happens in both the developed and developing countries. They just do not have enough defense defense left on our case to win our case. And now finally, Beckett says the most inevitable consequence is the suppression of minorities, and that gives us the Many Wayne, who says that we must reject every instance of racism. No life is worth living if some lives are valued over others. They never contest this way. Institutional racism is a systemic impact. It happens every second of every day. If we keep surveilling African Americans at disproportional rates, we normalize racism to the point that we start to ignore it, like my opponents have in this round. But second, the Bullard warning tells you that institutional racism is a prerequisite to targeting economic mobility and environmental racism, which are the two things that their case talks about. So even if you don't mind many, we are still a prerequisite to their case. And for these reasons, I strongly urge you to vote for the column.